Before we begin, don't forget that there are currently 3 applications out for the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we're going to take a close look at a position which I analyzed with a friend of mine, which begins with the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and now the very, very rare move bishop to g4. In working with players of the club level, what I found is that many times our opponents can actually introduce moves which we have never seen before. In fact, this move, bishop to g4, occurs extremely rarely in the database, and yet a player simply played this move and brought some questions into the game. During this video, I quickly want to examine how one might think through this kind of position and look at some of the various options which could have come about. Now, keep in mind, after the move pawn to d4, White's main aim is to eventually occupy the center with another pawn, either by playing pawn e2 to e4, or more often in the Queen's pawn opening, White goes for the move pawn to c4. And after pawn to d5, White most commonly plays pawn to c4, and this is known as the Queen's Gambit. Now, let's stop and ask the question. What is White's most common threat in the Queen's Gambit? What is White hoping to accomplish? Right away, ideally, White would like to be able to play pawn takes pawn on d5, queen takes pawn on d5, knight to c3, and bring a pawn up to the e4 square. This is the whole idea of the Queen's Gambit. But it's easy to forget this because in opening theory, we're very well acquainted with positions where Black goes out of his way to prevent this possibility. Usually with the move pawn to e6, the Queen's Gambit Decline, or with the move pawn to c6, the Slav opening. So in this case now we're looking at the move bishop to g4, and if we're playing a quick game or if we're at the board, we may be so surprised by the move bishop to g4 that we don't even take time to reorient and think about what is White's crucial threat in this position, which was to capture pawn takes pawn on d5. So now that we're confronted with an unusual move, how do we look at the position? First of all, we want to be acquainted with the strategic aspects of the position, and as I've said before, White would like to occupy the center with pawns. Secondly, we want to get acquainted with tactical aspects of the position, and this second piece accounts for a lot of what we have to think about when we take on an unusual position in the opening. By tactical points, what I mean is that we have to start engaging ourselves to look ahead into the position and to take concrete options into consideration. We do this by first of all establishing what are the candidate moves available in the position. Now, one move which is possible is pawn takes pawn on d5, carrying out the main idea of the position. Stop and think for a moment, what are some other moves which are possible? What are other ways to create threats, either short-term, long-term, or which simply improve our position? White might also try pawn to h3, moving the bishop away from the g4 square. White might also try pawn to f3, moving the bishop away from g4 and adding some defense to e4. Or White might also try the move queen to b3. Knight to c3 could also have come under some players' radars, but in this case I feel that pawn takes pawn on c4 is a little bit compromising, but let's go ahead and say that knight c3 would also be an option. Now, depending on the time control which is in the game, we would want to take some assessment of all of these possibilities. And while we do that, keep in mind that what we would be doing is broadening our understanding of the position as a whole. The more variations we calculate and the more moves we play through in our head, the more we'll be able to understand which of the options is better. In this video, which is going to be fairly short, I'm going to demonstrate very quickly what could have been white's most precise continuation here. Simply by capturing pawn takes pawn on d5, queen takes pawn on d5, knight to c3, the key threat in this position, white could have quickly got an advantage in this particular game. If the queen goes back to d8, there are multiple ways for white to continue. He can't go for pawn to e4 straight away because of the pin against the queen. But the move queen to b3 could be inserted, followed by pawn to e4. The move pawn to f3 could be inserted, followed by pawn to e4. And let's quickly examine that one of the downsides of this idea, let's say pawn to f3, bishop to d7, pawn to e4, whenever white plays the pawn to f3, he's done a little bit to go crossways of his development of the pieces on the king side. The bishop and the knight are going to have some problems developing because the knight now only has access to the e2 square, and if the bishop comes out to d3, this could block the defense of the d4 pawn. This probably isn't going to be such a big factor, as white can continue bishop to e3, bishop to d3, knight to e2, castles kingside, and then look for a plan, but it is useful to keep in mind that pawn to f3 is a little bit shaky because it removes the optimal square from the knight. Queen to b3 looks more strong in this case, or pawn to h3, bishop to h5, then queen to b3, followed by g4, bishop g2, pawn to e4, and some sort of defense for the d4 pawn. These would all be different opportunities here. Another way that black could reply after knight to c3 would be the move queen to a5. And again, white can play pawn to h3. This turns out to be probably most precise. Bishop to h5, queen to b3 with the idea of pawn to e4. And now with some help of some computer analysis to get familiar with all the different options here, I've come to understand that white can get an advantage after queen b6 because he's attacking the b7 pawn. Queen to b6. Now there are different ways for white to get an advantage, but I believe the strongest would be queen to a4 check. Now knight to d7 can be met perhaps with bishop to f4 or knight to d5 or g4 followed by knight to f3. All of these would be options. Or after the move pawn to c6, white can then play the very strong move knight to d5, queen to d8, and now knight to f4, picking up the bishop pair and bringing pawns to the center. And all of these continuations lead to an advantage for white. In fact, in the couple of games which I saw where players happened to reach this position after bishop to g4, white never actually managed to produce one of these solid replies. And so the value of this video is to first of all give you some concrete options if you ever encounter this position, but also to demonstrate that whenever we encounter an unusual move, we need to take into account the strategic factors and then also begin to look ahead for different options and calculate some variations in order to know how to continue. That's all I wanted to look at today. Thank you for watching this video. Before you go, be sure to check out the 2 applications we have available for the King's Indian Defense, available for iPhone and for Android.